Hello, I am Jeff MacDonald, correspondent with the Living Church, and I'm here with my new friend Mark Harris, who is at General Convention with us here at the 78th General Convention. Not Mark's first convention. He began coming to General Conventions in 1969.
That's right. Yeah.
And you have been coming ever since, having almost not missed even one.
I came the first time in my campus ministry role. I was at the University of Michigan, and I came to do circus worship, which was an effort in the middle of the night during a very, very difficult special convention to be able to give people some relief from the heaviness of the convention. Mm-hmm. And it was a profound service in which women, minorities, and other groups who felt displaced or out of the church stood over on the side, representatives that stood over the side and said nothing during the service until the time of the peace, where a clown-faced person came over and put white paint on them. Uh-huh. And they then began to interact with the clown, and then they interacted with the service. Well, of course, in 1969, this was fairly strange. Services were pretty staid at that point. Uh-huh. And so in my campus ministry work, and then when I was at the Church Center in campus ministry, we really tried to, in a sense, provoke the edges of liturgy, music, the arts, as well as provoke the edges of our engagement with justice issues. Mm-hmm. And so over the course of that time, until the early 80s, I was involved directly in campus ministry, and then I came to the Church Center in 1982, first to serve in campus ministry work, and then in charge of our overseas missionaries, and then finally as a partnership officer for the mission work of the church. In a sense, I've seen all of these things as being missionary, and sometimes they've appeared fairly radical, but they have not necessarily always been liberal. The difference between being radically involved in the church and change and possibilities for renewal and possibilities for inclusion is different, it seems to me, from taking a liberal stance on issues. So while we were involved in some fairly sharp kinds of uses of liturgy for social justice purposes, we were also in some ways very conservative around wanting to maintain the Eucharistic integrity, for example, of the liturgy. So it was a fascinating time to be involved in this work. And it's been sort of a lifelong concern of mine to try to relate the sort of prayer life, the constant liturgical life of the church, to issues of change and inclusion and that whole range of things.
Well, that's really been the story of the last 40 years, hasn't it?
Yeah, it really has been.
And you've lived it.
I've lived it in a fairly quiet kind of way. I've not been sort of up front part of that, but been, I hope, fairly consistent in terms of trying to look at how to be a Christian that Christians 1,000 years ago would identify with and say, oh, you're one of those, right? You're one of us, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, being a Christian who in this day and age, people would look at and say, oh, this is kind of interesting. I might want to be one, right? So it's the kind of the balance of how you deal with substantial changes in our understanding of the faith, while at the same time being recognizable as part of the same Christian body that was here 2,000 years.
Right. What draws you to General Convention this year, and what do you find especially interesting on the agenda this year?
I'm kind of lobbying for several issues. One of them is missionary engagement by this church in other countries, particularly in Haiti. My principal concern is this church has been, since the 1830s, has said that every member of this church is a member of the Missionary Society by virtue of their baptism. Okay, Ian Douglas spoke to this yesterday when he was speaking. Um, there's one of the resolutions that's being presented would strike that language from the canons, that we are all members of the Missionary Society. But I believe it's really important for the widow and her mite in a local parish to have some sense that the money that she puts in the collection plate as an offering, that in fact that's part of a missionary activity, that she's part of a missionary society, and that this money somehow filters out in some ways for the mission and ministry of the church, so that she is paying her missionary dues, right, to a society. If we lose that, what happens is the person in the pew gives the money to an organization of which she is not a part, or he is not a part. To the Domestic and Foreign Missionary Society. What in the world is that, right? If you're not connected to it, then you're giving money to something else, not to the whole body. So I'm here, among other things, to come and lobby, I hope successfully, for the notion that we can't break that connection between who we are and who the missionary society is. So that's kind of the second lobbying effort. And the third one is, I believe, and I think incidentally, just to give a plug for the Living Church, and the Living Church I think believes this too, that the issues about reconciliation of people who are in brokenness in the church is a really, really important piece of mission work. How do we work at reconciling people who have split apart in the past? Particularly since part of the split is we're all hurt, right? It's sort of like the question about what do you do with a couple where they've split up and it was messy, right? Mm-hmm. If you sit around and talk about the mess all the time, you're never going to get anywhere because everybody will just stay angry. So at some point you have to begin to talk about, okay, we've been through the mess, now who are we really with each other and with Jesus Christ? Is there any way to work reconciliation, not by trying to fix the past, but somehow talk about how we might work forward together? So I'm kind of pushing around the edges. That's the nice thing about being a lobbyist. You can kind of push around the edges. You don't have any responsibility, right? You don't have to vote on anything, but you can push around the edges and sort of say, wouldn't it be good if we figured out some way to start having public conversation that was fairly quiet but public about reconciliation between the Episcopal Church and those people who have left. Not harping on the horrors of the past, because the breakup wasn't easy, right? But sort of looking at what would it look like to kind of find a way forward for us to find that we're reconciled in the work of Christ in the world.
To have some kind of relationship with those from whom there's been a break. Is that right, that it's a matter of, because at this point the break is fairly recent, with many in parishes that were formerly Episcopal parishes, and so are you thinking that maybe there's not much of any relationship there right now to speak of, and that maybe General Convention is possibly going to give rise to an opportunity or two to begin forging such relationships?
No, I think I think this is too big. General Convention is too big, and the leadership of churches have to carry forward their investment with their organizations, right? Mm-hmm. I think the real place where conversation needs to begin is sort of in medium-sized organizations or even small organizations. Places like some of the seminaries where there are students from both church groups. Nashotah House, for example. Many of the schools now have some people who are coming from ACNA diocese and or with Episcopal students as well. And they're talking about sort of current issues about being students in the theological school together. The past may be there, but it's not a big deal. Or at least I don't think it's a big deal. In a local context of a parish, for example, where in a diocese or a parish there have been some people who've left, how do we begin to work together again? right, in ways that would make it possible to talk about a future together. Now, maybe there isn't any future together. I mean, church breaks are church breaks. I mean, we've got a long history of those, right? So maybe they're permanent. But we don't have to accept that they're permanent without any conversation. So one of the things I'm kind of poking at a little bit is who would be likely candidates to have that kind of conversation, not on a church-wide official level, but kind of a more local or less threatening kind of level.
And what would come of that besides individual relationships, which are not to be understated,
Yeah.
but what else could come of it?
Beats the hell out of me. All I know is if you don't have them, the chances of anything happening are pretty small. But for example, suppose in the context of a local crisis of some sort, a natural disaster, a terrible violence piece of some sort, local ACNA and local Episcopal Church people worked together along with other people, I mean, maybe in an ecumenical context, for example, but we're working together to address whatever the issue was, and found in that they actually had a lot more in common than previously supposed, because actually our prayer life is pretty close, right? And one of those ends up being a deputy to General Convention next time, right? That person can bring that experience to General Convention in the form of a resolution about their needs to be beginning conversations. That's the kind of, again, there's no direct connection between doing this kind of reconciling work and the major reconciling work of the churches. But if you, for example, had that experience locally, then if you came as a deputy and you found other deputies who had similar experiences, you could make a proposal that there be beginnings of interchurch conversations about reunion. Well, talking about reunion that's a big shift. If we don't talk about reunion at all, my concern is we'll become solidified into sort of ossified positions where it's really hard to change. I mean, for example, the break with the Reformed Episcopal Church 100 years ago. Well, that's ossified. It's really hard to break that and reconnect in a church union kind of way. If we don't act fairly soon, I think the differences will become ossified. They'll just be there, and there'll now be two churches.